Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2024, the summer of Trek. This is a BookTube event created by Vin at Revenant Reads. He's assembled a dauntless bridge crew of other booktubers to talk about Star Trek during the summer, which is when a lot of us associate the season with Star Trek. And I've been poorly neglecting Book Trek. I'm hoping to take up the slack on that for the rest of August. I've been neglecting Book Trek, even though I love Star Trek. I've been watching Star Trek forever. I love it. And Book Trek, the BookTube event, has been meant a lot to me. It's changed a lot of the way I think about Star Trek. I think that some of you would probably love hearing the Voxer chat that goes on between the co-hosts. Sometimes the fur flies. It's all in good fun, but it's sometimes very funny with us just hashing and rehashing what's going on with Star Trek and what has gone on with it. Of course, the main focus of Book Trek will be to read Star Trek fiction. You cannot. You can do an away mission here and again, read a book ghostwritten under the name of someone connected with Star Trek, a memoir of some kind or other. Or you can read a piece of popular science as an away mission, because Star Trek before New Trek was largely wanted to respect science, even if it pushed the boundaries of that. New Trek deals with magic instead of science, but the old Trek dealt with science. At least it tried to, even with the infamous technobabble. And I haven't been doing any away missions, not only because I don't tend to like behind-the-scenes stuff for anything. Director's cuts, extras on DVDs and whatnot. I've never understood the appeal of watching any of that. I've never understood the appeal of watching a director and an actor break down one of your favorite scenes in all of cinema and have the actor say, yeah, I was really constipated, I was in agony, I wasn't thinking at all, I just wanted to poop. Why have that in your head? Why do that to so-called movie magic? But the other away mission, popular science, I read a lot of that. I do that just in general, because the bulk of my reading is not rereading or booktube reading, despite the image you might get on this channel. The bulk of my reading is new releases in the American book market, in the 15 or 16 genres that interest me, and 2 of those genres are science and nature. So I do a lot of that reading anyway in every month. So I'm covered for that away mission, but that brings us to the main body, which is to read Star Trek fiction. I have a lot of complaints about Star Trek fiction. Once upon a time, I lapped it up like everybody else did because we didn't have anything. So I took whatever I was given. Because there was no Star Trek fiction that was in a book. There was no Star Trek fiction. Then it became an industry on its own. And suddenly you had more Star Trek fiction than you could read in a lifetime. And also that fiction had to deal with elements that were unusual on their own, and that I don't think have been very often mined for anything like their full potential. One of those main elements is time. Time passes in this franchise. This is not the same thing as we'll pick another beloved franchise. Pick Jeeves and Wooster. Time doesn't pass in Jeeves and Wooster. In Star Trek, our characters, when we first meet them in the 1960s, our characters are, they might not be played by actors to this effect, but on screen they are supposed to be fairly young. Jim Kirk probably in his early 30s, Bones McCoy probably a little older than that. I get the strong impression from the original show that Mr. Spock is supposed to be a good deal older than that, because he served for a long time with Captain Pike on the Enterprise. Spock is an old hand at the Enterprise long before Kirk gets there. In the old show. I'm not talking about Star Trek Strange New Worlds. We meet them there and we move on with the same actors in real time all the way to when they are retiring. Star Trek The Undiscovered Country, our crew is retiring. They're done with Starfleet. They are ready to stand down. They save the Federation president. They save the peace talks at Camp Kittimer. And then they, at the end of the movie, they are rudely told that they must return to Starfleet in order to be decommissioned. And they're all unbelievably crestfallen at that final moment. Mr. Spock says, if I were human, I believe my response would be, go to hell. And we don't know. It's just assumed that they are, despite Spock's saying that they are just going to turn around and go back and have the ship be decommissioned. We get an absolutely glorious montage of cast signatures as the music swells and the Enterprise literally flies into the horizon, flies into the sunset. And I read a book that was last night, I read a book that was recently sent to me by one of you. Very, very nice. I read this, Shadows on the Sun by Michael Jan Friedman, which is a Star Trek novel set right after that final scene. The Enterprise has been told you are to report back and be decommissioned, and the ship is to be decommissioned, but it stands to reason that the crew will largely break up and move on, and that the senior members of the crew might retire. They might just retire. This book takes as its starting point that Enterprise is suddenly given a mission by Starfleet. We know we said you are to come back and be decommissioned, but we actually have something that we want you to do. We have something that we want you to do on a planet that is undergoing all sorts of internal strife. We want you to go there, and we want you to liaison with the ambassador there and work out a problem on the planet Sasan, S-A-N. And Kirk goes right away. McCoy has been down in the dumps. All of them have been. Kirk goes right away to McCoy's quarters to tell him, believe it or not, we have a mission. Despite anything that any of us might have thought, we have a mission. And once McCoy learns what that mission is, it becomes pretty obvious to him anyway that the reason why the Enterprise has been chosen is because McCoy himself has a long history with the planet Sasan. A long history. From when he was in his late 20s and a medical intern on board the USS Republic. When he went there originally. This is a planet that's steeped in violence. And violence is actually a part of their social fabric. Assassination, going up the ranks, getting your way, it is almost entirely done, almost ritualized at this point, since it's happened for so long, into killing. You don't argue, you don't negotiate, you kill your enemies and get what you want that way. And McCoy learned this society, somehow managed to stay alive, a very young McCoy did, and thinks that maybe that's why the Enterprise has been chosen, because somebody noticed that in his file. There's another coincidence here. One of the things we know about McCoy from the original series that we never actually tantalizingly got to learn, it was in the book Bible, but it was never actually put on screen, is that McCoy is a divorced father of one. He has a daughter. And he has a wife, an ex-wife out there somewhere. And Star Trek fans have never been able to let go of that. I don't know quite why. I really don't. They've never been able to let go of that. I guess because there have been a million books on the subject of Jocelyn, Bones McCoy's ex-wife, and his daughter, Joanna. And I guess it's because they all studied up on the lore of the original show and knew that they came a hair's breadth away from getting an episode that actually said that was actually about that. Or it could be that they find a little bit of fascination in the diametric opposite between McCoy, who is, in these Star Trek fictions, immortally haunted by this divorce, and, for instance, Jim Kirk, who is a womanizer, a famous womanizer. I don't know what the fan fascination is here. I've never found it all that fascinating. And I have been waiting for an author to make it fascinating to me. And Michael Jan Friedman is not that author. No author has been able to do it so far. Even though Friedman stacks the deck here, because in the modern day mission to Sasan, the Federation ambassador is Jocelyn, McCoy's ex-wife. And that adventure is fairly well done. It very much takes a back seat to McCoy's personal history here. This is a Bones McCoy novel. As a Bones McCoy novel, it's not quite as good as there was a trio of novels, original series Star Trek novels, set around the idea that what about the alternate timeline in which McCoy goes back in time to the 30s through the Guardian of Forever, but Kirk and Spock don't succeed in saving him and letting Edith Keeler die. They don't succeed in doing that. So there's an alternate timeline out there in which McCoy just lives his life in the 20th century. And there were a trio of novels written about that. You may have heard Randy Ray mention them. The one on McCoy is excellent. much closer to what I think large parts of this book were trying to be than this book is. Because this book gives us a lot about McCoy's personal life, but it also gives us a lot about that modern day adventure, in which there is some fine character interaction. I'll get back to that, about the character interaction and what I don't like about it. But the bulk of this book is medical intern McCoy on board the Republic with his other fellow medical interns. They are interns. I didn't know that there were interns. Does McCoy ever have an intern in Star Trek? They're interns on the Republic under its chief medical officer, under its version of Bones McCoy. Only Vincent Bando is the man's name, and he is not an equivalent of McCoy. He's a mean, carping, grudge-holding, larger-than-life, vindictive persona who dominates the flashback sequences all through the book of that younger McCoy, learning about Sasan, learning about assassination culture. Bando actually absolutely dominates all of those pages without ever being interesting. He's never interesting. Even when Friedman, I think probably on some level, realizes that and eventually has his antisocial, abrasive behavior escalate to actual psychopathy, where he tries to strangle Bones McCoy with his bare hands. Even then, he's not interesting, and he's a huge part of this book. I didn't get that decision at all, and I didn't like it. It made the thing drag for me. And also, well, another drawback here, both in the flashbacks to young McCoy and also in the present day, the old on the edge of retirement McCoy, is a subject that gets very little in the way of thought from most mainstream novels, certainly very little in the way of thought from the original Star Trek series, which is what medicine would be like in the 23rd century, or here on the doorstep of the 24th century. What would medicine be like? Look at the advances that medicine has made just in your own lifetime. What would medicine be like here? You could say, well, there's no way for you to know because those advances in medicine would not have been uniform between now and the era of Star Trek. Earth goes through a cataclysmic world war that brings the world to rubble. They have to rebuild from scratch. So we don't know. You can't measure a steady progress. But what about attitudes? What about all of it? I don't know. There's one point in this book, later on in this book, where McCoy is asked by someone on Sasan, of course, if you've got a culture built around ritualistic assassination, you're going to have some very pronounced attitudes about murder and death and mourning and lifespans. And Friedman is very good about that. I could almost have stood to read a novel of his just set on the planet that he created without Star Trek. Couldn't sell it, but I'd almost have been content to read it. And one of those characters asked McCoy at one point, well, what about suicide? What about suicide? You're a doctor, you're a healer among your own people. What do your own people have to say about it? And McCoy says not only is it frowned upon, but it's in most cases forbidden. I don't think that would be true. I don't think that would be true. That's that and many other things. McCoy, of course, intervenes when he shouldn't. He, of course, medically is almost always willing to break the Prime Directive, including on Sasan, including in both cases, both the present day and in the past as a 26-year-old intern. I was hoping that the past scenes of intern McCoy and the present scenes of disillusioned and embittered McCoy, the book starts with him wondering what the word retirement even means. What does that even mean? I'm going to go home and do nothing? I'm not going to practice medicine on a starship anymore? I'm not going to practice medicine at all anymore? Those are legitimate questions, and I'll get to that. But I was hoping that those two halves of this book would combine better than they do, but they don't. There's a ham-handed attempt to combine them at the end, but not really. It doesn't really work. And the two McCoys are way, way too similar. They're way too similar. There's 65 years between the McCoy who's in those older scenes and the McCoy who was ready to retire at the end of The Undiscovered Country. And also, as long as we're talking about character development, I should point out here for Spock, for McCoy, for Kirk, Maybe not so much for Sulu and especially Chekhov. I mean Uhura and especially Chekhov. They come across better. Again, I would have wanted. Maybe Michael Jan Friedman has written a novel about how Uhura and Chekhov face the decommissioning of the Enterprise. If not, they should. If not, there ought to be a novel written by someone who isn't doing fan service, written by someone who isn't being watched over by lawyers in reflective sunglasses. Something called, The Day We Came Home, or The End of the Voyage, or something like that, where we get character studies of what it means to these people to leave the Enterprise. Which has been their home for so long, in so many adventures together. Uhura and especially Chekhov are a little bit better fleshed out here, but my main problem with the characterization of Kirk and Spock and McCoy is the one that I've voiced many times here before. They don't seem it. They don't seem like what they would be. They've seen everything together. They shouldn't seem this way in this book. They shouldn't seem so cardboard. There wasn't much character in the Undiscovered Country. There wasn't much to go on there, and none of it was consistent with anything that we had seen before. But even so, I would have accepted echoes of Undiscovered Country in this book, and I didn't get really many of those either. I enjoyed this, believe it or not, despite everything I'm saying. I enjoyed it. I kept turning the pages, but especially when a Star Trek novel is about these older characters, these characters who have seen everything, done everything, especially when I get a book about these older characters, there aren't many of them, I want them to be more. I want them to feel that way, and they don't ever feel that way. In any of the ways that they would be, they don't ever feel that way. So, I don't know. A little bit discouraging, but I did enjoy this, and I'm so tremendously grateful to the person who sent it. So that's my book trek report for today. I will be back. I will try to throw a Star Trek book on the pile for tonight. So I'll be back tomorrow. I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.